So, the first thing I want to do today is go over this timeline with you guys. Pretty much everything on this timeline is going to be um, talked about here today in this PowerPoint. First off, over here, 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh sends an expedition to the Americas. We'll talk about Sir Walter Raleigh and his expedition. This expedition was known as the Roanoke expedition. They settled in a um, section of what is now today North Carolina. Obviously, it wasn't North Carolina then because the United States wasn't a thing. This is just a English colony. But in 1587, the Roanoke expedition with Walter Raleigh. So that's the first thing on the timeline. And then you can see years pass after this first expedition, this first Roanoke colony. And then we come on 1606. The London Company sends 3 ships to America. So we'll talk about the London Company today and how they financed the expeditions, the English expeditions to North America. So that first happened in 1606. Okay, so 1607, the London Company establishes the colony of Jamestown. You may have heard of Jamestown before. It was the first successful English colony in what is present-day United States. We've talked about how the Spanish have already established the colony of St. Augustine by this point, and the French have already established Quebec by this point. But Jamestown was the first successful English colony, and that it was in 1607. So moving down here to 1609, 500 additional settlers joined the Jamestown colony. So Jamestown at first was rather small colony, group of people from England that had come to settle in the New World, which was the Americas. But then a couple years later, 500 additional settlers joined. So a couple years after it was first established, it grows in size to over 500 people. Moving up here to 1612, John Rolfe begins planting tobacco in Jamestown. This is a huge occurrence. It's a huge point in the history of the United States. Tobacco being planted for the first time by English settlers. John Rolfe is a name that will come up in this presentation here today. Very important figure in American history because of his contribution of tobacco being grown in what would eventually become the United States in 1612. Moving down here to 1614, Pocahontas and John Rolfe marry. You've probably heard of Pocahontas before. Maybe you've seen the Disney movie about Pocahontas. But the real Pocahontas had a pretty interesting story as well. Pocahontas was a Native American princess who married this extremely powerful Englishman, John Rolfe. And moving up here to 1617, Pocahontas actually dies of smallpox on her way home from London. So Pocahontas and John Rolfe were married. She went back to London with John Rolfe to see the old world with her husband. And on her way back to her homeland of the Americas, she actually dies of smallpox. So they don't have that in the Disney movie, but the real life story of Pocahontas is pretty interesting as well. Moving down here to 1619, the first Africans arrived in Jamestown colony. This spurs back to 1612, John Rolfe planting tobacco. So just a few years after John Rolfe plants tobacco, Africans arrive in the Jamestown colony. And we'll talk about why Africans were needed in the Jamestown colony, but it has a lot to do with John Rolfe planting tobacco. Okay? And like I said, that's a huge reason about why it's so important to U.S. history as a whole is these Africans coming and starting in 1619. Also in 1619, the House of Burgesses meets for the first time, and we'll talk about that. That's going to be in your questions to be able to answer. The House of Burgesses. It's a form of government. First meet for the first time in 1916. And in 1622, John Rolfe was killed during a surprise Native American attack. So that was the end for John Rolfe in 1622. So pretty much everything in this timeline is going to be covered in this guide reading for today, 5-1, and it's going to be on the English settlers in Virginia. Okay, so let's move on. Next slide. So these are your questions that you're going to have to answer for today. Let's run through these so you know what you should be looking for while I'm going through this presentation with you. So first question, what happened to Roanoke, the first English settlement in America? So Roanoke, you have to understand this isn't the name of a person, this isn't a name of a group of people necessarily, it's the name of a settlement. Remember I talked about how Sir Walter Raleigh was the first to try to establish a settlement in Americas. Roanoke was the first one. So you have to tell me what happened to this Roanoke colony. Okay. Next question. Why did the English want a colony in North America? So we've talked about what a colony is. It's a settlement. It's where a group of people from an already existing country move to a new piece of land that's not connected to their original country. So in this case, it's the English. England is across the Atlantic Ocean. Why did these people come from across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas to set up a colony? So why did they want to do that? So you're going to have to tell me there. Next, how did the Virginia Company of London raise the money to finance the cost of a new colony? So how did this group of people, this company, this Virginia Company of London, how did it raise the money to finance the cost of a new colony? So finance the cost of a new colony, that means to kind of get it started. Starting a new colony away from your original country across the Atlantic Ocean isn't a cheap undertaking. It costs a lot of money. You need to pay for a ship to get across the Atlantic Ocean. You need a crew to sail the ship across the Atlantic Ocean. You need to find people that are willing to start this new colony. You need supplies for this new colony. It's a lot of money that goes into starting a new colony. And how did they come up with this money? This Virginia Company of London came up with the money to start these colonies. How did they do that? Next question. What hardships did the first settlers in Jamestown face? You've maybe heard of Jamestown before. Jamestown was the first successful English colony, but it wasn't all easy sailing for the people of Jamestown. They ran into some hardships. So hardships basically means having a hard time. What made it tough on the first settlers in Jamestown? What was tough about their stay or their trying to start the Jamestown colony? Next, what was important about Virginia's House of Burgesses to the history of the United States? So we talked about how the coming of tobacco was really important to the history of the United States, and it had an effect on how the rest of U.S. history fell into place. Also, this House of Burgesses was really important to the rest of U.S. history. Okay, so keep an eye out for that. What was important about Virginia's House of Burgesses to history of the United States? So those were the questions you have to be able to answer. Make sure you're paying attention for these 5 questions, and be paying attention. You need to be able to answer these to get full credit on those questions to be able to answer. Okay, so let's get started with the PowerPoint presentation. English settlers in Virginia. So we'll start with Sir Walter Raleigh. We mentioned him on the timeline. He gained permission from Queen Elizabeth to establish a colony in the year 1585. So he was the first Englishman that wanted to or got permission to come across the Atlantic Ocean and start a colony. And he did that in 1585. So after he got permission, a group of people led by John White sailed to the Americas and landed on Roanoke Island, where they started a small colony. So you can see this blue map of the United States. Roanoke Island's down here in what is now North Carolina. So that's where James White started this colony of Roanoke Island. Sir Walter Raleigh got the permission, and he's the one that really wanted to do it. He got the permission from Queen Elizabeth, but it was actually this John White who led the expedition, who led the settlers to Roanoke Island. So after a few weeks, White sailed back to England to get more supplies, leaving behind a little over 100 colonists. I believe it was 118 colonists were left behind at Roanoke Island as White sailed back to England to get more supplies. Like I said, it's not an easy undertaking. It's not an easy thing to do to start a colony. White came over, got it started, but then he was going to go back to England to get more supplies, more food, and other things. They went to build shelters. He went back to England, but then he couldn't come back for 2 years. 2 years went by where he couldn't come back. He had started this colony, 118 people were there, and then 2 years later, sailors from England came back to Roanoke Island in 1590, where they found that colonists left there, the people that had been left there 2 years earlier, had disappeared. So 118 people disappeared. And that was this Roanoke Island. So that was a failure, this Roanoke Island. It was not a successful colony because they were not able to stay alive. They were not able to continue on as a colony, and they vanished sometime in those 2 years that this John White was gone back to England getting supplies. So Roanoke, unsuccessful. Nobody really knows what happened. They could have been wiped out by neighboring Indian tribes. They could have starved to death. They ran out of food. Starvation might have killed them. They might have gotten sick. Disease might have killed them. Nobody knows for sure because there was nobody left. All 118 people were killed somehow. They died somehow, and the Roanoke Island was not functioning anymore when White returned. So next up, by 1600, the Spanish had gained a fortune from gold and silver in the Americas, and France had done the same through the fur trade. So we've talked about the Spanish coming over to Central America and South America, as well as kind of the southern parts of what's now present-day America. And they came over and they overthrew, they conquered the existing Native American empires and took gold and silver. So that's how the Spanish during this time that the English were failing at Roanoke, the Spanish were already getting a lot of money from gold and silver. And also during this time, the French were doing the same thing with the fur trade. Remember, they were coming to northern parts of North America as well as down the Mississippi River, and they were trapping and trading furs with Native Americans and sending them back to France. So the Spanish and the French were a lot more successful right away, gaining wealth and gaining riches off of the Native Americans and off of the land of this new world. Remember, the Americas were the new world and Europe is the old world. The Spanish and French were already over here doing really well, getting a lot of money, while the English were busy failing at Roanoke. The English were up here in Roanoke Island, and people were dying, and they were not doing well, while the Spanish and French were doing well in the Americas. Okay, so the English king, James I, was unwilling to risk his private wealth. That's a big reason why the English weren't doing so well. They didn't have as much money put into or invested into invested into getting money out of the Americas. But English merchants were interested in putting forth some money to try to make more money off of the Americas. So these English merchants saw how well the Spanish and French were doing in the Americas, and they thought to themselves, we got to get in on this. We need to put some money into this so that we can gain some money off of the Americas as well. So they were willing to put their money into coming over to the Americas and trying to do like the French and Spanish had been doing and make some money. This word merchants basically means somebody with enough money to own a ship or a fleet of ships and willing to use this ship or the multiple ships to go to a different place and either trade or haul cargo to make money. So merchants are people who have ships and are willing to use the ships to make money. So these English people with big ships wanted to get in on what the Spanish and French were already enjoying in the Americas. So these English merchants formed the Virginia Company of Plymouth and the Virginia Company of London. So these are two countries. The purpose of these two companies, the purpose of these two companies was to share the costs of starting a colony. So like I said, it's expensive starting a colony. You need to raise money. So these merchants started these two companies to try to get some money together to get people to the Americas so they could start making money off of the Americas like the Spanish and French had already been doing. And the way they did this was to have investors pay for the cost of settlement by buying shares of stock, hoping that would make a profit. So you may have heard of the stock exchange, you've heard of the stock market. This is the same thing. So if you buy stock, you're putting money in, hoping that you'll get money in return. So you put money forth so that hopefully in the future you'll get money back. So these merchants talked investors, they talked people into putting up some money. They said, okay, we'll give you some money. Go start a colony in the Americas, and with that colony, do something that makes money for us back here in London. And the way they are going to do this is to be farmers. The Spanish, their way of making money in the Americas was to take gold and silver. The French, their way of making money in the Americas was to trap animals and trade and sell the fur. The English way of doing this was going to be to farm. So that's how these companies, this right here is how these companies got the money together to start these colonies. They had investors who paid the cost of the settlement, got the settlement started by putting money in, and they bought stock hoping that they would get profit, and they were going to do this by farming. So the first colonists in Virginia named their settlement Jamestown after their king in England. So this, going back to this, these investors who paid stock in these companies got the money together. Roanoke had already failed, so they got more money together to start another colony, and they started this colony of Jamestown. So they started this colony of Jamestown, and they named it after their king in England. Remember, King James I was the king in England, so they named it after him. They also named the river that Jamestown was on the James River. So it's Jamestown and the James River. Jamestown was established on a peninsula 60 miles up the James River. There was many drawbacks that came with settling here on the James River. These drawbacks were that the land was really swampy. It was tough farmland, wasn't really great farmland here right along the James River. With the swampy land came mosquitoes. So the bugs were really bad. The bugs made them sick. You had diseases from the mosquitoes. and also there was a lack of good water. The water was still salty, right off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, and they didn't have much for freshwater rivers, so there was a lack of good water as well. So these are some drawbacks. These are some bad things about living on the James River and starting this colony of Jamestown. There were some good things about living in Jamestown. There were some good things about creating this settlement on the James River in what's now Virginia. If you look down here, this is kind of what Jamestown, this is a drawing of what Jamestown looked like. It was a triangular fort. So a reason for building a fort with walls like this was because the settlers of Jamestown were afraid of Spanish attack. The English and Spanish at this time were not getting along. They were enemies, and the English were afraid that the Spanish would come and destroy their settlement in the New World, destroy their Jamestown colony. So they built this fort right on the river, so it was a good spot to see if Spanish enemies were coming right on the James River. So that was a good thing about living in Jamestown. You could see if the Spanish were coming. Also, another good thing about living on the James River, on this peninsula 60 miles up the James River, was that they could trade with Native Americans easily. You can see it's right on the water here. So it was an easy water route right next to the colony, so they could trade with Native Americans. So those were some good things, but along with those good things come bad things like swampy land, mosquitoes, and a lack of good water. So these were the drawbacks here. This bullet point number 2, drawbacks of living in Jamestown. Moving on, as English gentlemen, the first Jamestown colonists didn't have the skills needed to live in the wilderness. So pretty much what happened was that in England, a bunch of these gentlemen, a bunch of these rich guys who really just wanted to go on an adventure, thought to themselves, oh yeah, I'll go over to the Americas and it'll be all, it'll be a big adventure, it'll be really interesting to go over there. But what they didn't realize is that they were going to have to go over to the Americas and do some hard work. And to live in the wilderness, they were going to have to build shelters. They had to build this fort. They had to farm the land. So it was hard work. So Jamestown got off to kind of a bad start because these gentlemen, these rich guys from England, didn't know how to live in the wilderness. But to fix that, they put John Smith in charge. John Smith was a great leader from England. He kind of whipped these gentlemen into shape. And a famous quote from him was that those who don't work won't eat. So if these gentlemen just thought they would go out and explore new lands and not work on building the fort or work on farming the land, they wouldn't get to eat. So this John Smith turned things around for Jamestown and got it back on track. John Smith was the leader of the Jamestown settlement. Also, a thing that saved the Native Americans saved the settlers, saved the colonists at Jamestown, was that the Native Americans supplied them with corn and fresh water. So if it weren't for the Native Americans taking mercy on the people at Jamestown, the colonists at Jamestown, it would have been like Roanoke, and they would have all died out. But the Native Americans took mercy on them, and they supplied them with corn and fresh water that helped the colony survive. So the two things that kind of turned it around for Jamestown was that they got John Smith in charge. He kind of whipped the gentlemen into shape. He got them working. And also the Native Americans were helpful in bringing corn and fresh water. So the success of Jamestown really started up when the colonists learned how to grow tobacco. Tobacco already had existed in the New World. Native Americans had tobacco already, and they smoked tobacco, but it wasn't a very high quality tobacco, and it wasn't like tobacco that we have today. So the English brought tobacco from more Central America area and started to grow this, and it took off. That's how Jamestown really started to make their money, is they grew tobacco, and then shipped the tobacco back to England, and people in England bought it, and they got huge profits in Jamestown from selling tobacco because of the climate. The weather is perfect for growing tobacco in Virginia, so they could grow lots and lots of tobacco and sell it back to the New England colonies and all of Europe. All of Europe was smoking the tobacco grown in Virginia at the Jamestown colony. So that's how they made a lot of their money. You remember me mentioning John Rolfe in the from the timeline? John Rolfe was the man behind the tobacco industry and married a Native American princess named Pocahontas. So we talked about these two. John Rolfe was the man who really started up the tobacco growing in the New World. So he was a very powerful man. And he ended up marrying a Native American princess named Pocahontas. The way that Pocahontas got involved with the English settlers, the English people at Jamestown, was that John Smith's pictured here where I'm circling with the red dot. This is John Smith, the leader of the Jamestown settlement. He was actually captured by the Native American tribe that Pocahontas belonged to. And Pocahontas' father was the chief of the Native American tribe that captured John Smith. So they wanted to kill John Smith because he was leading this new territory, this new settlement, and that it was taking their land, taking the Native Americans' land. So the Native Americans wanted to kill John Smith. But Pocahontas begged her father not to kill. Her father was the chief of the Native American tribe. She begged her father not to kill John Smith. She took mercy on John Smith. So John Smith was let go, and John Smith remembered that, and he remembered this Native American princess that saved his life. So she was a friend of the Jamestown settlement, and she eventually met John Rolfe, like I said, the very powerful man who was behind the tobacco industry, and they ended up getting married. And then I told you the story about how she went to London and actually ended up dying on the way back from smallpox. So that's how Pocahontas comes into the story of the settlement of Jamestown and the English settlers, and Pocahontas with John Rolfe. So Pocahontas was actually John Rolfe's wife. So along with the farming of tobacco came the need for labor. So I talked about in the timeline how a few years later, after the English started, after they started growing tobacco, they needed people to work the fields. So the English brought African slaves to America to serve as indentured servants on tobacco plantations. So they were growing lots of tobacco. They needed people to work the fields. There's a picture down here of tobacco fields. They needed people to work the fields, so they brought people from Africa to be slaves and work as indentured servants. So pretty much what indentured servants means is that you work for a certain amount of time and then you're let free. So actually the first African people brought to the United States, or to America, to the New World, were not full-on slaves that were lifetime slaves. They were actually indentured servants, so Africans could be set free after they worked for a certain amount of time. As time goes on, indentured servitude goes out the window, and African slaves are enslaved for life, but that is more later in U.S. history. But that's why this is so important to U.S. history, because this John Rolfe starting the tobacco industry in the New World brought the African slaves, which leads to the economy of the South depending so much on slavery, which leads to the Civil War, and it goes down the line. Lots of our American history has to do with this exchange right here of tobacco starting up in the New World, and African slaves being needed to work the fields. So next, the English recognized that in order to grow their American colonies, they would need to start families. So in 1620, about 100 women sailed to Jamestown. Prior to 1620, Jamestown was it was mostly all men living in Jamestown. But when you have all men, you don't have families. So they brought in over 100 women to Jamestown, and this is how the colony really started to take off, is when people started to get married and have families, and there's kids in the colonies, then the colony could really grow, and it would be a permanent colony rather than just a place where a bunch of guys were growing tobacco and making money. It actually turned into a legitimate permanent colony that was going to last for a long time. The Native Americans mistrusted the English, like I was talking about with the Native Americans capturing John Smith. This was due to tensions between the Native Americans and English beginning to rise because more and more land was used for the growing of tobacco. So as the English were gaining more and more money off of the tobacco industry, they were using up more and more of the Native American land. And we remember talking about how dear to their hearts the land was to Native Americans from our first chapter. So the Native Americans in the area were not happy about losing their land that they held so sacredly and so close to their hearts. They were not happy about losing that land. So tension began to rise. They mistrusted the English, and that's how that's how the conflict between Native Americans and the English started. Originally, straight off the bat, they were allies. They worked together. Native Americans kept the English alive, but then as the English got more and more greedy for more and more money off of tobacco, they used more of the Native Americans' land, and tensions rose, and they were no longer allies. So, the Virginia Company of London granted colonists a voice in running the country. So while all this is happening, while the women are starting to come to the colonies and starting to start families, and it's becoming a more legitimate, permanent colony, this Virginia Company of London granted colonists a voice in running the colony's government. These Virginian colonists, who were adult, free men, they elected representatives or burgesses to a lawmaking body called the Virginia House of Burgesses. So people, adult men, could vote and be representatives of the people in these Virginian colonies to this Virginian House of Burgesses. It was the first form of representative government in the United States, and that is a huge part of a huge spot to start with how the United States would be run and why the United States came about. Representation of the people was a key reason why the United States formed as a country. Obviously, the United States wasn't a thing yet. There was still at this time, Virginia was still a colony of England, but it would lead to the forming of the United States, and this was the first representative government in the United States, and that's something the United States prides itself on so much, is having a representative government. So this Virginia House of Burgesses was the first form of representative government where the people are represented, so the people have a voice in the government. This was the first example of that. But King James I took back the Virginia Company of London's charter, making it a royal charter. So that means that it was under complete control of the king. So the king, even though the colonies were making lots of money for the king, this King James wasn't very happy about this Virginia colony having so much freedom. He didn't like that they were running their own government. He wanted the colonists to be under English control, British control. So he took away this London's charter, so there's no more representation, and it instead became a colony that was completely under the control of the king. So the king made all the rules. Instead of people being able to elect representatives and have a voice in their government, it went instead in the direction of the king having complete control. So that's the last slide. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask me. Hopefully this helps. Having this voiceover on. That's the presentation on the English settlers in Virginia.